Snow moved through the gap in a thin white line, crossing the floor and touching the corner of a burial notice pinned crooked to the log wall. A tin cup rattled on its hook each time the wind pushed harder. Beneath the kitchen table, a child watched a man's wet wool coat drip onto her father's boots, which no one had moved since the funeral. The man set $30 on the table without being asked. He did not look at the boots. The woman across from him did not look at the money. She closed the ledger without touching either one. 2 weeks after the burial, snow still lay in thin white ridges across the cabin floor. Not drifts, lines, precise as ruled marks on a ledger, tracing every failed joint between the logs. Althea Mercer stood inside the 12 by 16-foot room that was supposed to be a home and counted the places where winter entered. She stopped at 40. There were more. Asa Mercer had died 19 days earlier when a timber set collapsed in the Spotted Horse Tunnel above Maiden, Montana territory. The mine paid nothing. Asa had worked by the shift, no contract, no death benefit, no company obligation beyond hauling his body to the surface. What Althea received was a canvas sack containing his hand tools, $15 in final wages, and a coffin bill for $23.60, $8.60 more than everything her husband had earned in his last week alive. She buried him on the slope behind the cabin because the ground in the Maiden Cemetery cost $4, and she could not afford to be buried beside him. Nell was 8. She had not spoken a full sentence since the morning 2 men from the mine carried her father's toolbox to the door and set it down without entering. She followed Althea through the cabin now like a second shadow, close enough to touch, but never reaching. The survival math was not complicated. It was simply impossible. The cabin measured 12 by 16 feet with 7-foot walls. Asa had built the shell the previous autumn from local pine logs, cutting and notching them himself because hiring a team cost $60 he did not have. The chinking, a mix of moss, clay, and creek mud, had been applied too late in the season. Freeze-thaw cycles had cracked it through before Christmas. By February, approximately 180 feet of log joints had opened enough to pass air. On a still night, the gaps merely leaked. When wind struck the northwest face, the cabin breathed. Althea had $18.40 after the burial and the filing office fees that preserved Asa's claim in her name. She had 1 3/4 cords of split pine stacked against the south wall. A sound cabin with tight joints might stretch that fuel through March if the stove burned carefully. But this cabin was not sound. Heat left through every seam as fast as the stove could produce it. She calculated, the way her father had taught her to calculate, with real numbers and no wishful ones, that she needed at least 5 cords to survive the remaining winter in a cabin this porous. 5 cords she could not buy, could not cut alone, and could not haul from the slopes with a bad wrist and an 8-year-old girl. Hiring a crew to repair the exterior chinking required scaffolding on the downhill wall, fresh materials, above freezing temperatures to let the daubing cure, and money. She lacked every one of these things. Leaving required 2 railway passages to somewhere with family willing to take a widow and her child. She had no family willing. She had no money for passage. And abandoning the claim for more than 6 months meant forfeiture. The land reverting, Asa's work erased, every dollar they had spent on filing fees and improvements vanishing into the title records as though the Mercers had never stood on that ground. She could not fix the cabin. She could not heat the cabin. She could not leave the cabin. And the cabin, as it stood, could not keep them alive. 3 days after Althea counted the floor lines, Tobias Venn rode up the track from Maiden. Venn was 58 years old, a former Fort McGinnis carpenter who had built officers' quarters, storehouses, and barracks with properly seasoned timber and government-issued lime. He now contracted building work across the Judith Mountains district, and he had promised Asa the previous autumn that he would inspect the cabin's chinking after the first thaw. Asa's death had not canceled the promise. It had accelerated it. He did not knock. He lifted the latch, stepped inside, and stood in the center of the room with a lantern raised above his head, even though the sun was still up. The lantern was not for general light. It was for seeing into cracks. Nell pressed herself against Althea's leg and watched from beneath her mother's arm. Ven did not greet either of them. He crossed to the northwest wall and pressed the flat of his belt knife into the chinking at chest height. A section the length of his forearm broke loose and fell to the floor in 3 dry pieces. Behind it, gray daylight showed through the joint. A band of sky no wider than a finger, but continuous for nearly 2 feet. He moved to the next joint. Same result. He knelt and tested the lower courses, where snowmelt had saturated the daubing and frozen it into a crumbling shell that looked solid and held nothing. He tested 8 joints across 2 walls. 5 had failed completely. 2 more gave under moderate pressure. 1 held, but the moss behind it was frozen and brittle, and he told Althea it would release the moment a warm day loosened the ice. He turned to the woodpile visible through the open door. He studied it the way a doctor studies a patient he has already diagnosed. "You have less than 2 cords," Ven said. "A sound room might stretch that. This room will feed the wind before it feeds you." Althea said nothing. She had done the same arithmetic. Ven set the lantern on Asa's table and folded his arms. He told her what the cabin required, and he listed each item the way a man lists costs at a land office. Precisely, without emotion, because precision is what remains when sympathy has nothing to offer. New blocking driven into the deepest joints. Moss or fiber packing stuffed behind each block. Clay and lime daubing applied over the packing in layers, each layer allowed to set before the next. Several consecutive days above freezing for the material to cure. Wet daubing applied in freezing weather cracked before it bonded and left the wall worse than before. Scaffolding on the downhill wall where the logs stood 9 feet above grade and no one could reach the upper courses from the ground. And if none of that could be completed before the next severe cold, 4 additional cords of fuel at minimum to compensate for what the walls continued to lose. "That is $40 in labor and materials I do not have," Althea said, "and weather I cannot order." "Then find a man who will do the work on promise of payment, or find a warmer room in Maiden." "There is no man who works on promise for a widow without land title, and the rooms in Maiden cost $2 a week." Ven picked up his lantern. He paused at the door and looked at the wall he had just condemned, at the failed joints, the floor lines, the frost forming inside the upper course where the roof met the logs. "Boards cannot make a broken wall whole," he said. "They can only hide where the winter enters." He meant it as a caution against cheap concealment. He did not know he had just described the architecture that would save her. Lyman Dorr arrived 2 days later, though Althea suspected he had been waiting for Ven's verdict before making his offer. Dorr was 46, the owner of Maiden's largest general store, and a silent investor in 2 freight operations supplying the mining camps. He sold provisions, hardware, blasting supplies, and credit. The credit was the engine. Half the claims in the Judith Mountains ran on Dorr's account books, and when a claim failed, when a miner broke his back or a homesteader abandoned in March, Dorr's terms allowed him to collect against movable property at his own assessed value. He did not need to cheat anyone. He only needed to wait. Althea owed $42 at his store. The debt was secured against her milk cow and wagon, not against the homestead. The unpatented claim could not serve as collateral, but the cow provided Nell's milk, and the wagon was the only way to haul anything heavier than a sack. Losing them meant losing the ability to feed a child and the ability to work the land. Dorr sat at Asa's table and opened his ledger to the page marked Mercer. He turned the book so Althea could read the column of figures, then placed $30 in banknotes on the table beside Asa's mud-stiff boots, which still stood next to the door because moving them felt like burying him again. Relinquishment, Dorr said. $30. You sign, the claim reverts. I file on it proper in my name. You can stay through spring, move to town when the road opens. Stay through spring on whose terms? On my generosity. In writing? Dorr smiled the way a man smiles when he has been asked a question he was hoping to avoid. He did not answer. In writing meant a contract. A contract meant Althea had standing. Dorr did not give people standing. A woman with a child cannot maintain an isolated claim through a mountain winter, Dorr said. That is not judgment, Mrs. Mercer. That is arithmetic. Althea looked at the $30. She looked at the ledger. She looked at Asa's boots. The arithmetic I see says you want my timber and my spring, she said. And this claim is worth 10 times what you are offering. Dorr closed the ledger. He stood and buttoned his coat. I will collect the cow and wagon on the 1st of March if the account is not reduced by $12. That is also arithmetic. He left the money on the table. Althea did not touch it. After the door closed, she placed the banknotes in an envelope, wrote Dorr, refused on the outside, and set it on the shelf beside the door where she could see it every time she passed. That night, she burned 11 pieces of split pine in 4 hours. The cabin never climbed above 43 degrees. A tin cup of water near the outer wall developed a skin of ice while Nell slept. At 2 in the morning, Nell woke coughing, a wet, deep sound that came from the chest, not the throat. Althea dragged their mattress beside the stove, and as she pulled it across the floor, she saw ash moving in a thin gray stream across the boards, blown by a widening joint on the east wall that had not been opened 2 days before. She lay with her arm around Nell and stared at the log wall in the stove's red glow. Ven was right about the answer. Clay, lime, scaffolding, mild weather, skilled hands, money. He was right about every part of it, and every part of it was beyond her reach. The question that kept her awake was not whether the conventional solution was correct. The question was whether the conventional solution was the only one. The blanket changed everything, though Althea did not understand it for 3 days. She took Asa's heavy wool blanket, the one she could not sleep under because it carried his smell, and the smell made Nell cry, and nailed it across the worst section of the northwest wall, 2 feet wide, floor to ceiling. She did not expect it to insulate the cabin. She expected it to stop the visible ash drift that was settling into their food. The blanket bowed inward each time wind struck. It rippled and pressed against the logs and swelled back, but the oil lamp on the table, the flame that had been leaning sideways for weeks, pointing away from the wall like a finger showing the wind's path, went vertical. Still, quiet. Althea watched the flame for a long time. She held her palm near the blanket. Cold radiated from the wool, but it was not pushing. On the other side of the room, where no blanket hung, the cold moved. It had direction and pressure. Here, behind the wool, the air was simply cool and motionless. The distinction was small. The room was still freezing, but one section of wall had changed its behavior. That night, Nell sat by the stove drawing pictures with a charcoal stick on brown paper, and she asked a question that had been waiting since the funeral. Mama, why didn't grandfather's ice melt in summer? Althea's father had kept an ice house near Marietta, Ohio, a pit dug into a hillside, lined with logs, packed with blocks cut from the river in January. The blocks were buried in sawdust and straw, and the ice lasted into August. Nell had spent 2 summers there. She remembered carrying buckets of sawdust. She remembered the cold fog that crawled over the pit's edge when the cover was lifted, and the way the ice blocks looked blue and ancient in the dark. Althea had not thought about the ice house in years, but Nell's question unlocked a memory so specific she could feel it in her hands. She was 10 years old. Her father had pushed her bare hand into the fibrous packing, sharp sawdust under her fingernails, the sweet resinous smell of fresh-cut pine, warmth from the summer air trapped between the particles. Then he placed that same hand against the exposed surface of an ice block. The sawdust was cool. The ice was brutal. The difference was immediate and absolute. Feel, her father had said. The straw does not produce cold. It holds still air, and still air is the worst conductor of heat that a poor man can find. 25 years later, wind entered her cabin through every failed seam, and the stove could not overcome the walls because the walls were not merely cold, they were open. The wind replaced warm air with freezing air faster than the iron box could produce heat. The cabin was not losing a battle against temperature. It was losing a battle against moving air. Stop the movement first, then slow the remaining heat transfer. The blanket had stopped the movement across 2 feet of wall. The ice house had proved that loose fibrous material could slow heat loss for months. What if she built both? A barrier to stop the air, a cavity filled with dry material to slow the heat. Not on the outside of the cabin, where weather and scaffolding and money made repair impossible. On the inside. Althea did not leap from memory to construction. She tested the principle 3 times because her father had also taught her that an idea observed is not an idea proven. The first experiment was crude. She built 2 boxes from scrap boards, each roughly a foot on every side, open at the top. She heated 2 stones of similar size on the stove until they were too hot to hold barehanded, then placed 1 in each box. Around the first stone she packed dry pine needles gathered from beneath the trees uphill, pale, brittle needles that snapped cleanly between her fingers. The second stone sat alone in an empty box. She covered both with flat boards and placed a small lump of butter on each lid. The butter on the empty box began to firm within an hour and was hard in less than 2. The butter on the insulated box remained soft and spreadable for nearly 5 hours. Nell pressed her finger into it every 30 minutes and reported the results with a seriousness that almost made Althea smile. The second experiment addressed the wall. She nailed 2 scrap boards across a 6-inch section of open log joint, leaving a gap between the boards and the logs. She stuffed the gap loosely with dry needles. Then she hung a wool thread from a nail in front of the inner board and watched it. The thread barely moved. Behind the boards, she could hear wind pushing through the log joint. Snow continued to accumulate in the gap between the logs and the boards, but the air on the room side of the inner board was still. The thread hung nearly vertical. The inner board and not the fill, was the air barrier. The fill slowed heat transfer through the cavity. The board stopped moving air from reaching the room. Both together created a condition that neither could produce alone. Still, insulated air between the cold outer shell and the warm interior. The third experiment failed, and the failure was essential. She filled one sack with pale, dry needles from the forest surface, material that snapped when bent and smelled of resin. She filled a second sack with the darker needles from the lower layer, where decomposition had begun turning them into soil. She placed both sacks near the stove to simulate the heat they would absorb inside a wall cavity. Within a day, the dark sack was warm and damp to the touch. It smelled of wet earth and something faintly sour. The pale sack remained cool and dry and smelled of pine. The dark material held moisture from the forest floor. Moisture conducted heat far faster than air. Moisture also meant rot, mold, insects, and eventual structural collapse inside a sealed wall. Only the driest surface litter could be used, and it had to be kept dry after installation. Any wall design that sealed wet material behind boards was not insulation. It was a slow fire or a hidden ruin. That night, Althea sat at Asa's table and drew a plan on the back of a feed bill. A second wall built 1 foot inside the log shell. Rough, vertical boards. Whatever damaged lumber she could buy cheaply. Staggered joints covered with narrow battens. Cloth strips pasted behind the battens with flour glue to seal the smallest gaps. A 12-inch cavity between the new inner wall and the old outer logs. Dry pine needles and screened fibrous litter packed loosely enough to trap air pockets, but firmly enough to resist immediate settling. Removable boards at the top of each wall section for refilling when the material compressed over time. Removable inspection panels near the floor for checking moisture and vermin. And she wrote this in larger letters and underlined it twice. No organic fill of any kind within 3 feet of the stove or stovepipe. That zone she left blank on the drawing. She did not know what to put there. She only knew what could not go there. The 12 by 16 foot cabin would shrink to roughly 10 by 14 feet inside the new wall. The room that already felt too small would become smaller. Asa's table would barely fit, but a smaller room held less air, and less air required less fuel to heat, and the walls that enclosed that air would no longer give the heat away. The cavity required approximately 330 cubic feet of dry fill, roughly 70 large sacks, several hundred pounds of material gathered from the mountainside, screened by hand, dried near the stove, and packed into wall bays by a woman with 2 numb fingers and a child who weighed less than the sack she would need to lift. Althea looked at the drawing until the lamp burned low. Then she calculated the cost of the boards. Mina Noyes found her the next afternoon, crouched on the slope above the cabin, filling burlap sacks with pine litter. Mina was 39, the wife of a rancher whose property bordered the lower edge of Althea's claim. She was the nearest neighbor and the closest thing to a friend the mountain provided. She was also practical in the way that ranch wives had to be practical. She measured actions against survival, and she measured fast. She watched Althea snap each handful of needles between her fingers, discard anything that bent without breaking, reject a full sack because the bottom layer had darkened with moisture. She watched all of this without understanding any of it. "What exactly are you building?" Mina asked. Althea explained: the boards, the cavity, the fill, the air barrier, the principle of still air, the 2-box experiment, the thread hanging motionless in front of the test panel. Mina listened with the particular expression of a woman who has heard a great many plans from a great many people and learned to sort them quickly. "Pine litter belongs under boots, not around a stove," Mina said. "It will settle to the floor inside a month. Mice will carry it into the bed and nest in the wall. You will hear them chewing every night. And if the stove throws one single coal, Althea, you will have built the largest tinderbox in the Judith Mountains." Althea could answer the settling. The removable top panels allowed refilling. She could answer the mice. The lower bays could be packed tighter and inspected through removable floor panels. She could not answer the fire. Mina saw the hesitation, the silence where a ready answer should have been. I have a spare room, Mina said. For Nell, not for you. I cannot feed 3 extra, but Nell can stay with my girls until this business is settled one way or another. Accepting meant separating. It meant Nell 3 miles away while Althea occupied the cabin alone. And if Althea left the claim for extended periods to visit, if the cabin stood empty for days while she walked the winter road to hold her daughter, the occupancy requirement weakened. Dor would hear about it. Dor heard about everything. A claim holder who did not occupy was a claim holder who could be challenged. Nell stays with me, Althea said. Mina studied her for a long moment. Then she looked at the sacks, at the cabin below, at the sky that was the color of old pewter and promised nothing gentle. Then finish your wall before the weather decides for you, Mina said, and walked down the slope without looking back. The gamble was explicit, and Althea made it with open eyes. She could spend her $18.40 on fuel. At Dor's prices, and Dor was the only supplier within practical distance that bought approximately 1 additional cord. Combined with her existing wood, she would have less than 3 cords. In a cabin bleeding heat from every joint, 3 cords lasted until early March if she rationed the stove to 8 hours a day, 16 hours of cold every night. Nell sleeping in a room that dropped below freezing before midnight. Or she could spend the money on materials for a wall that might cut her fuel consumption in half, or might burn the cabin down. She walked to the Maiden Mill yard and priced what she needed. Nails, $2.10 for 8 pounds of mixed sizes. Cloth for ceiling strips, $1.40 for a partial bolt of unbleached muslin left over from a mining camp order. Boards. This was where the calculation either worked or ended her. New milled lumber cost more than she could consider, but the mill and the mining operations above Maiden produced waste. Twisted board ends, split planks, packing crate panels, rejected ore box lumber with nail holes and acid stains, material that no contractor would accept for finish work, material that cost the mill money to haul to the waste pile, material that a woman with $5.70 left in the world could buy if she was willing to stand in a cold yard and argue for 2 hours. She argued for 2 hours. The mill foreman finally sold her enough damaged lumber to cover approximately 200 square feet of wall, enough for 3 walls if she cut carefully around the worst defects, for $7.20. With nails, cloth, flour for paste, and a small pot of hide glue, a tanner's apprentice sold her for 60 cents. The total reached $12.70. That left $5.70 for food, lamp oil, and every emergency between now and spring. Althea counted the coins into the foreman's hand. She thought about Dor's $30 on her shelf. She thought about Ven's assessment. She thought about a lump of butter softening on a box lid for 5 hours while the uninsulated stone turned cold. She had chosen. If the wall worked, she could survive the winter on the fuel she already owned. If the wall failed, if it caught fire, if it rotted, if the principal collapsed at full scale, she had spent her food money on board she could not eat. The men at the mill yard watched her stack twisted planks and sacks of pine litter on a borrowed handcart. Tobias Venn happened to be collecting door lumber at the far end of the yard. He stopped his work and watched Althea heave a warped board onto the pile. He looked at the sacks. He looked at the boards. He looked at Althea's wrist brace. He laughed once. Not cruelly, but with the incredulity of a man who has built with proper materials his entire life and cannot process what he is seeing. She is building a hayrick inside her house and calling it carpentry. Ven said to the foreman. Althea asked if he had cheaper dry lime. He said no. She loaded the last sack, gripped the cart handle with her good hand, and started up the track. The cart had a broken spoke that pulled to the right on every rotation. She compensated by leaning left, which strained her damaged wrist, which made 2 fingers go numb after the first quarter-mile. She stopped 4 times on the 2-mile climb. Each time she flexed her hand until feeling returned, checked that the load had not shifted, and pulled again. Nell walked beside her carrying a cloth bag of nails, 8 pounds of iron in an 8-year-old's arms. Nell did not complain. She had not complained about anything since the funeral. The silence terrified Althea more than the cold ever had. They reached the cabin at dusk. Althea unloaded the lumber against the south wall, stacked the fill sacks inside away from the stove, and fed Nell beans and bread with the last of the dried apple butter. She added 3 pieces of pine to the fire, sat at the table, and took out her plan. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been dismissed by someone who understood the old way but could not imagine a new one? Because what Althea carried up that mountain was about to meet the one person who could see exactly where it would fail. The design was sound in principle and deadly in one detail, and Althea knew it. The blank zone on her drawing, the 3-foot exclusion around the stove where no organic fill could go, was not a feature. It was an admission of ignorance. She could build the wall. She could fill it. She could seal it. But she could not guarantee it would not burn unless someone who understood how fire moved through hidden spaces told her where the danger actually lived. The next morning, before the sun cleared the eastern ridge, she wrapped the scorched test board from her blanket. Fire incident in a piece of cloth put Nell in double coats and walked 2 miles down the mountain to Maiden. Behind the assay office, in a lean-to workshop with a forge, a bench, and a collection of tools organized with the precision of a man who had lost fingers to carelessness and would never lose another, Orrin Peel was replacing the bottom rail of an ore box gate. Peel was 64 years old. Born in Maine, trained in a shipyard, he had joined the Army as a civilian carpenter during the war and never gone home. He had built mine chutes, ore boxes, wagon beds, barracks floors, and furnace housings across 4 territories. The 2 smallest fingers on his right hand were gone, taken by a circular saw in a mill outside Helena, and the remaining 3 gripped tools with the compensating strength of a hand that had learned what mistakes cost. Althea did not ask for help. She did not explain her situation. She unwrapped the scorched board, placed it on his bench, and asked a single question. Where would the fire travel first? Orrin turned the board over. He studied the scorch pattern. A dark fan spreading from one edge where the paper had flared in the stove incident. He ran his thumb along the char line. He noticed, without being told, that the board had been cut with staggered seams. He noticed the cloth strip pasted along one edge. He noticed the pine needle fibers embedded in the glue. He did not ask what she was building. The evidence was on the board. He answered her question by laying 3 scraps of wood on his bench. The first 2 he butted together with a visible gap. The third he placed over the gap as a batten. He struck a match and held it beneath the gap. The flame licked through instantly, curling around the batten and reaching the upper surface. Then he sealed the gap with a strip of wetted clay, pressed the batten over it, and repeated the test. The flame hit the clay and stopped. Heat radiated through the wood, but no flame passed. No air fed the fire from behind. Fire needs 3 things, Orrin said. Fuel, heat, and air. Your wall gives it fuel. The stove gives it heat. The only one you can remove is the air path between them. He looked at the scorched board again. But you also need to break the contact. Dry needles touching hot iron is not an air problem. It is a stupidity problem. He said this without malice. He said it the way a man states a measurement. Can you show me how to build the break? Althea asked. Orin studied her. He studied the board. He studied the three-fingered hand that had taught him what carelessness costs. Bring me your drawing, he said, and bring every piece of scrap iron you own. Althea returned to Orin's workshop the following morning with her feed bill drawing, Asa's hand tools, and 3 pieces of scrap iron salvaged from a broken stove grate she had found behind the maiden livery stable. Orin unrolled the drawing and held it flat with a chisel and a plane. He studied it for several minutes without speaking. He traced the wall line with his 3-fingered hand, pausing at each corner, each window opening, each junction between wall and floor. When he reached the blank zone around the stove, he tapped the empty space twice. This is where you stopped, he said. That is where I do not know what to build. Orin nodded. He did not compliment the rest of the design. He did not need to. The staggered seams, the battens, the removable panels, these told him that the woman standing in his workshop had thought about her problem with the discipline of someone who could not afford to think carelessly. He pulled a stool beside the bench and began the first lesson. The wall, he said, had to do 3 things in sequence. First, it had to stop air from moving through the room side of the boards. Second, the cavity behind the boards had to slow heat from conducting through the fill. Third, the zone around the stove had to break contact between anything combustible and anything hot. Miss the first, and the fill was useless. Wind would blow right through loose needles. Miss the second, and the boards alone were not enough. Wood conducted heat faster than trapped air. Miss the third, and the cabin burned. He showed her how wind could pass through a board seam even when fibrous fill sat behind it. He placed 2 boards edge to edge on his bench with a deliberate 1/8-inch gap. Behind the gap, he packed a handful of dry needles. Then he blew through a reed straw aimed at the gap. Air came through. The needles slowed it, but did not stop it. Loose fill was not an air barrier. Only continuous board surface with sealed joints could stop the moving air. Run the boards vertical, Orin said, so you can reach each bay from above to refill. Stagger the butt joints. Cover every seam with a batten. Paste cloth strips behind the battens. Your flour glue will hold if the boards stay dry. Seal the floor junction with rope fiber pressed into clay. Seal the ceiling the same way. Leave removable top panels for settlement and lower panels for inspection. He made her repeat the sequence. Then he made her describe where each seal would fail. The floor junction would crack if the board swelled. She would need to repack it. The cloth strips would loosen if moisture reached the paste. She would need to inspect and repaste. The top panels would shift if the wall flexed in wind. She would need to wedge them. Every answer was a maintenance task. The wall was not a permanent solution. It was a system that required attention. Good, Orin said. A wall you can fix will save you. A wall you cannot reach will kill you. The second lesson was shorter and more physical. Orin opened 3 sacks Althea had brought. He thrust his hand into each and sorted the material by feel, by smell, and by sound. He discarded needles that bent rather than snapped. He held suspect handfuls against his cheek and rejected anything that felt cool with dampness rather than cool with temperature. He sniffed for soil rather than resin. He crushed samples in his fist and looked for black humus, green needles, fragments of fungus, or anything that compressed into a wet clump rather than springing apart. 2 of the 3 sacks failed. One contained lower layer material Althea had missed during screening. The other had been stored near the cabin's leaking north wall and absorbed moisture overnight. Your nose is faster than your hand, Orin said. If it smells like forest floor, it belongs on the forest floor. If it smells like the tree it came from, it belongs in the wall. He told her to spread acceptable material across the loft floor in thin layers and turn it twice a day. The loft sat near the roof peak where rising stove heat collected. Warmth and air movement would drive moisture out of borderline material within 2 or 3 days. But the drying racks had to stay well clear of the stovepipe, at least 3 feet of open air between the nearest needle and the nearest hot surface. Nell became the inspector. Twice a day she climbed the ladder, turned the spread needles with a wooden paddle, and reported to Althea whether the material snapped or bent. She took the job seriously. It was the first task that made her part of the project rather than a witness to it, and Althea noticed that Nell's silence began to break around the edges. A word here, a short sentence there, always about the needles. The third lesson took an entire day and most of the next. Orrin would not allow the organic cavity to approach the stove, not within 3 feet on any side, not within 4 feet above. The stovepipe, which rose vertically through the roof, generated surface temperatures that could ignite dry pine needles on contact and could heat adjacent wood to charring temperature through sustained radiation alone. Together they designed the mineral fire break. The foundation was flat stone, creek rock carried up from the drainage below the cabin and laid in a double layer across the floor behind and beside the stove. Above the stone, they packed the cavity between the outer logs and the inner boards with rubble and clay rather than pine needles. Orrin mixed the clay with creek sand to reduce cracking. Over the clay-packed rubble they placed sheet iron, salvaged from an ore roaster casing that the maiden assay office had discarded after replacing its furnace lining. The sheet iron was stained and bent but intact, and it created a reflective barrier between the stove's radiant heat and the wall behind it. Around the stovepipe itself, Orrin built a separate empty chase, a 4-sided box of boards held away from the pipe by iron spacers. The chase contained no fill of any kind. Air circulated freely inside it, carrying heat upward and away from the combustible roof beams. A removable inspection panel at the base of the chase allowed Althea to check for fallen embers, shifted connections, and any material that might have been pushed into the gap by wind or vermin. When the fire break was complete, Orrin dropped a live coal from the stove onto the stone and clay section. The coal sat on dry stone, glowed orange, and died. Nothing caught, nothing smoldered. The nearest pine needle was 38 inches away, separated by stone, clay, iron, and an air gap. "If you wake up smelling smoke," Orrin said, "open that panel first. If the chase is clear, the fire is somewhere else. If the chase is not clear, you have minutes, not hours." He said this with the flatness of a man who had watched buildings burn and knew exactly how fast minutes passed. Construction began on the north wall, the worst wall, the most exposed, the one Venn had condemned with his belt knife. Althea measured and cut each board at the cabin, working on a pair of sawhorses Orrin had lent her. The damaged lumber from the mill yard was not uniform. Widths varied from 4 inches to 11. Lengths ranged from 3 feet to nearly 7. Nail holes, splits, acid stains, and warps made every board a negotiation between what she wanted and what the material allowed. Day 1. She erected the vertical framework for the north wall. 6 studs cut from the straightest boards, notched at the top to accept a horizontal plate, toe-nailed at the bottom into a sill she had spiked to the floor. The stud stood 12 inches away from the log wall, creating the cavity. 56 square feet of wall surface. She nailed the first course of boards to the studs before dark. Day 3. The north wall was fully boarded. 14 sacks of dry fill sat inside the cavity. Althea packed them by hand, standing on a box to reach the upper sections, pressing the needles firmly enough to stay in place. but loosely enough to preserve the trapped air pockets that Oren had told her were the entire point. She nailed the battens over the seams and pasted cloth strips behind each one with flour glue she had cooked that morning. The room already felt different. Not warm, not yet, but the air along the north wall had stopped moving. The lamp flame, which still leaned when wind struck the exposed west wall, stood vertical when she moved it near the finished surface. Day 5. Althea's wrist failed. The old injury, damaged when a wagon overturned 3 years earlier, swelled along the joint until she could not grip the hammer overhead. The pain was not sharp. It was deep and structural, the kind that told her the bones inside were protesting work they had never fully healed from. 2 fingers went numb and stayed numb. She could hold a nail but not drive it above shoulder height. She lost a full day. She soaked the wrist in warm water, wrapped it in strips torn from a flour sack, and tried to work left-handed. The boards went crooked. Day 6. Oren came up the mountain. He did not come because Althea asked. He came because she had not appeared at his workshop for 2 days, and silence from a woman building a wall alone in winter meant either completion or collapse. He examined the wrist, said nothing about the swelling, and spent 3 hours fashioning a lifting brace from scrap wooden rope. The device worked like a lever. She placed the board in a cradle, stepped on a foot pedal, and the rope lifted the board to the height she needed. She could hold it in position with her good hand and drive nails with measured, careful strokes that did not require the damaged wrist to bear overhead weight. It was not fast, but it worked. Day 7. 29 sacks installed, less than half the total cavity filled. The west wall was framed but not boarded. The south wall was not started. The east wall, which contained the door and the worst structural complications, had not been touched. Day 9, the weather betrayed her. A warm wind swept through the Judith Basin and turned snow to rain. Water streamed down the exterior log walls and entered through the original failed joints. 2 completed bays on the north wall absorbed moisture from behind, water wicking through the log shell and soaking the outermost layer of pine fill. Althea discovered it during an evening inspection when the material near the logs felt cool and damp rather than cool and dry. She removed both bays entirely. 14 hours of packing work, pulled out and spread across the loft to dry. The walls stood with 2 empty cavities while she waited for the material to recover. Day 10. Door's payment deadline passed. He sent a man with a rope to collect the milk cow. Althea stood in the doorway and watched the animal walk down the track. Nell pressed her face against the window frame. The cow had been Nell's responsibility, feeding, watering, milking, and its loss removed the only fresh food the child had access to and Althea's only potential spring income. Dor did not come himself. He did not need to. The message was the cow walking away. Day 12. 48 sacks installed across 3 walls. The south wall was complete. The west wall was complete, except for the window framing. The north wall had been repacked after the moisture incident. Food in the cabin had reduced to beans, flour, dried apples, and coffee. Althea calculated that their provisions would last 3 weeks if she reduced portions. Nell was already thinner than she had been at Christmas. On the evening of day 12, Mina Noyes appeared at the cabin door after dark, carrying 4 bulging sacks. She did not explain where the material came from or when she'd gathered it. She set the sacks inside the door, tested each one by snapping a handful of needles, and reported the results to Althea as though she were delivering a supply order. Dry, all 4. I checked twice. Althea started to thank her. Mina cut her off. I have been watching your chimney smoke, Mina said. You burn less wood than you did last week. I can see it from the ridge. I do not know why yet, but less smoke means less fuel, and less fuel means you are either dying or winning. She looked at the finished walls. She touched the interior boards. She listened to the wind moving behind them, a muffled sound like water running under ice, present but separated. It is strange, Mina said. I can hear the storm inside the wall, but I cannot feel it. She did not call it a conversion. She helped Althea hold boards, while Althea nailed the west wall window framing into place. Her assistance was practical, wordless, and over in 2 hours. She left without discussing the fire risk, but she had brought 4 sacks. She had noticed the smoke, and she had touched the wall. Tobias Venn returned 3 days later. He did not announce himself. He walked into the cabin, looked at the transformed interior, the room visibly smaller, the walls smooth with vertical boards and narrow battens, the air still and warm near the stove, and began his inspection without asking permission. He removed one of Althea's top panels and reached into the cavity. He pulled out a handful of fill and examined it, dry, resinous. He pushed his hand deeper and felt the temperature gradient, warm near the boards, cold toward the logs. He pressed his palm against the outer log surface inside the cavity and found frost. The fill is dry, he admitted. The air seal is competent. The stove bay is better than competent. Then he listed the ways it would fail. Settlement by spring. The material would compress under its own weight and leave gaps at the top of each bay. Rodent infestation, whilst mice would enter through any gap larger than a 1/4 inch and nest in the warm fill. Condensation. Warm, moist indoor air meeting the cold log surface could deposit water on the outer side of the cavity, slowly saturating the fill from behind. Fire if the stovepipe shifted during a storm and directed heat toward the fill. And rot, hidden behind the boards, invisible until the wall began to smell. Althea showed him the removable top panels for settlement. She showed him the inspection panels for moisture and vermin. She showed him the mineral stove bay with its stone, clay, sheet iron, and empty pipe chase. She showed him the cloth-sealed seams. Ben studied each one. He pressed the seals with his thumb. He looked into the pipe chase. He examined the stone floor of the fire break. You have answered mistakes I named, he said. You have not answered the winter. He meant the real cold. The cold that came with wind so fierce it did not merely enter cracks. It pressurized entire walls. The cold that dropped mercury below 0 and held it there for days while wind stripped heat from any surface it touched. Venn had lived through such weather in this district. He had seen what it did to structures built by professional hands with proper materials. He did not believe that boards and pine needles would survive what proper lime and clay sometimes could not. He left without condemning the wall outright. He left without endorsing it. He left a silence that weighed more than any verdict. A telegram reached Fort McGinnis 3 days later, warning of violent wind behind the warm spell. The sky remained mild, almost spring-like, with warm Chinook gusts that melted surface snow into black channels running downhill through the pines. The contrast between the gentle air and the warning's language unsettled everyone who heard it. Althea had one wall bay still unfinished, the section beside the door on the east wall, and 12 sacks of fill still damp from the rain incident. The material was spread across the loft, drying in the stove heat, but it was not ready. She had perhaps 2 days before the weather turned. She could wait for the sacks to dry and risk the storm arriving with the bay open. Or she could seal the bay empty, close it with boards, and pack it with whatever she could find: blankets, wool scraps, dry rope. knowing that this section would be the weakest point in the entire wall. She chose the empty bay. She doubled the boards, packed the cavity with folded blankets and rope fiber, and sealed it as tightly as she could without the benefit of 12 inches of dry pine fill. The wall was closed. 306 of the planned 330 cubic feet of cavity were properly filled. 24 cubic feet beside the door contained cloth and rope instead of insulation. The system was complete, except for the one section that stood directly beside the only exit from the cabin. Orrin helped Althea fit the last removable panels on a cold, still morning when the sky had turned the color of lead. The cabin contained 66 sacks of fill rather than the planned 78. The insulation averaged 10 to 12 inches deep, except beside the door where it averaged 4 inches of compressed blanket. The inner room was now 10 feet by 14 feet. Asa's table fit against the south wall if the chairs were pushed underneath. The stove occupied the northeast corner behind its mineral fortress. The mattress lay on the floor beside the stove, and Nell's sleeping area filled the space between the south wall and the table legs. The room that had felt inadequate at 12 by 16 now felt impossibly small, but it was still. The air did not move. The lamp flame stood vertical in every part of the room. Orrin borrowed 2 thermometers from the Fort McGinnis post surgeon. Instruments intended for monitoring hospital temperatures, accurate enough for the comparison that mattered. They placed one near the stove, one at the far north wall, chest height, where the finished insulation stood at its full 12-inch depth. During an ordinary night at 6 degrees above zero, near the stove, 71 degrees, far north wall, 63 degrees, floor beside the north wall, 56 degrees. Wool threads hung at board seams throughout the room, motionless. One armload of split pine lasted nearly twice as long as the same quantity had lasted before construction. The cabin was warm, not comfortable in the way a well-built house was comfortable, but warm enough to sleep without coats, warm enough to keep water liquid overnight, warm enough to stretch the remaining fuel through March if the weather cooperated. Orson Vale arrived that afternoon from the fort. He rode a heavy-boned horse with winter fur so thick the saddle sat 2 inches above the animal's spine, and he carried a repeating rifle across his lap because he had passed wolf tracks on the exposed saddle between Maiden and the Mercer claim. Orson was 41, former trapper, packer, buffalo hunter, and winter courier, a man whose profession was moving through country that sensible people avoided. He supplied venison, hides, and firewood to Maiden, and he had quietly observed Althea over the previous months, refusing charity, bargaining precisely at the store, carrying her own loads uphill while other widows sent their children begging. He did not admire her the way men admired women. He admired her the way he admired weather, something that operated by its own logic and could not be argued with. He brought a report from the fort. The weather was wrong. Warm wind and rapid snowmelt had the horses sweating under winter coats. A hard, dark line had appeared on the northwest horizon, visible from the fort's observation post. Post personnel were securing roofs, closing shutters, and bringing livestock into covered shelters. The telegraph operator had relayed a warning from stations further west, describing wall winds and whiteout conditions moving east. "Take the girl to Maiden," Orson said. "The road is clear now. It will not be clear tomorrow." "The road crosses the exposed saddle," Althea said. "If the wind arrives while we are in the open, we die on the trail instead of in a warm cabin." Warm. Orson looked at the board walls. He looked at the stove. He did not understand what he was seeing, but he could feel it. The room was warmer than any log cabin he had entered that winter. Warmer than any room in Maiden except the ones with brick chimneys and plastered walls, Althea said. Orson left extra wood, a quarter cord stacked against the south wall. Althea insisted on recording its value in her ledger. He did not argue. He had learned that arguing with her about debts was like arguing with the mountain about direction. I will come back if the wind changes, he said from the doorway. The door closed. Within an hour, the first gusts arrived. They were not yet violent, just probing, irregular pressure that made the cabin creak and sent the wool threads near the doorbay trembling. The blanket-packed section flexed. The temporary board shifted with a sound like someone leaning on a fence. Althea wedged a chair against the weakest board. Nell climbed into bed without being told. The sky turned black an hour before sunset. The temperature, which had been above freezing all day, began to fall. The wind found its direction northwest and stopped probing. It committed. By nightfall, the mercury outside had dropped below zero. The trees on the ridge above the cabin bent southeast. The sound that reached through the walls was not the whistle of wind through cracks. It was a sustained hiss, the sound of snow and ice crystals being driven horizontally against the log shell at speeds that stripped bark from exposed surfaces. The crisis had arrived. The outer chinking failed first. Within the first hour, long strips of the remaining daubing, the sections Venn had not tested because they still held when he visited, cracked away from the log joints under wind pressure and fell into the gap between the original wall and the new interior boards. Althea heard them go, small impacts like gravel dropping into a box. Then the hiss grew louder in those sections as wind entered the log shell unobstructed. Snow followed. Fine, dry, powdered snow driven through the open joints, filling the cavity behind the boards, piling against the pine needle fill from the outside. Althea could not see it, but she could hear it, a whispering scratch that moved along the north wall, like something alive was crawling through the space between the worlds. The interior boards flexed. She watched them by lamplight. The battens bowed inward a fraction of an inch, then settled. The cloth-sealed seams held. The air on the room side remained still. The wool threads near the north wall hung motionless, while snow and wind tore through the original structure behind them. Near the stove, 72 degrees. Far north wall, 65 degrees. Nell sat on the mattress with Asa's ledger open on her knees. She had appointed herself the record keeper. Every 30 minutes she read both thermometers and wrote the numbers in her father's careful columns, using the same pencil with the tooth marks that Althea had used to draw the wall plan. 6 pieces of split pine burned in the first 3 hours. Before construction, the same period would have consumed 11 or 12, and the temperature would have struggled to reach 45 degrees. Now the stove heated a smaller room whose walls held the warmth instead of channeling it into the wind. The storm built steadily through the second hour. The cabin shook. Roof beams groaned. The stovepipe rattled against its ceiling brace. Outside, the world had become a horizontal river of white, snow moving parallel to the ground at speeds that made standing impossible and breathing dangerous. The doorbay failed next. The emergency panel beside the door, the one packed with blankets and rope instead of 12 inches of dry fill, bowed inward under sustained wind pressure. The doubled boards flexed far more than the properly filled sections. One nail pulled halfway free with a metallic shriek that made Nell flinch. A second nail followed. The gap between the boards widened by a quarter inch, and cold air, not a draft but a blade of cold, cut through the rope packing and reached the room. The far wall thermometer dropped. 65 became 63. 63 became 61. The room was losing heat through a section smaller than a tabletop. Althea could not open the wall to repack it. Opening the boards meant exposing the room to direct wind. She braced the failing panel with Asa's table, driving it against the boards like a barricade. She cut 2 diagonal braces from scrap lumber and nailed them across the panel's face. She packed rope into the moving seam with a bread knife, forcing fiber into the gap each time the wind let the boards relax for a moment. The thermometer steadied at 59. Then it began to recover. 60. 61. The braces held. The rope held. The table held. But 59 degrees was the lowest the room had been since the wall was completed and the storm was still building. In Maiden, Orrin Peel sat beside his workshop stove and listened to the wind flatten itself against the assay office wall. He knew the mineral fire break was sound. He had built the stone and clay base himself. He had positioned the sheet iron. He had sized the pipe chase. He trusted his work because he had spent 40 years learning what happened when a man did not trust his work and built carelessly. But he also knew the door bay was improvised. Althea had closed it with blankets and rope because the fill was not dry in time. An improvised seal under normal cold was adequate. An improvised seal under 80-mile-an-hour wind was a prayer. His hip, damaged in a fall from a mine scaffold 3 winters ago, would not carry him up the mountain track in this weather. He could not walk the 2 miles. He could not ride. He could barely cross his own workshop without the wall for support. Orson Vale stood in Orrin's doorway with his coat already buttoned and his hat tied down. "Do not go because she is a woman alone," Orrin said. "Go because one wall was finished in fear, and fear makes poor measurements." Orson roped himself to his horse for the first exposed mile above Maiden, where the trail crossed bare rock and the wind struck from the side with enough force to stagger the animal. The horse lasted 3/4 of a mile before it refused to face the wind. Orson dismounted, tied the horse in the lee of a rock outcrop, and continued on foot. He pulled himself forward using tree trunks as handholds, moving from pine to pine, his face turned away from the wind because the driven snow was cutting exposed skin. He could not see the cabin. He could not see 30 feet ahead. He followed the track by memory and by the angle of the slope under his boots. Inside the cabin, the stovepipe shifted. A roof brace, one of the poles supporting the sodden board roof, tore loose from its notch when a sustained gust flexed the entire structure. The brace had been holding the stovepipe's upper section steady where it passed through the ceiling. When the brace moved, the pipe moved with it. A metallic crack echoed through the room. The pipe tilted 2 inches to the east, and the joint where 2 sections met separated by a finger's width. Hot ash fell through the gap. It dropped into the empty inspection chase, the fireproof box Orrin had built around the pipe. A shower of glowing fragments landed on dry stone. Althea smelled scorched cloth before she saw anything. The cloth wrapping around the chase's lower panel had caught a spark. She removed the iron inspection panel and saw a bright orange fragment lying on the stone floor of the chase, 3 inches from the edge where the stone ended and the pine-fill cavity began. Orrin's fire break had caught it. Stone, clay, and an air gap stood between the ember and 300 pounds of dry pine needles. She hooked the glowing fragment out with stove tongs, burning her palm through the thin leather glove she wore for stoking. She beat the smoldering cloth against the stone floor until it was out. Then she bound the separated pipe joint with wire, looping it around a ceiling beam and twisting it tight with a nail used as a handle. The pipe steadied. The joint closed. Her palm blistered and wept where the heat had reached through the glove. Had she packed the cavity continuously? Had she ignored the blank zone on her drawing or filled it with needles because she ran out of stone? The ember would have landed on combustible material inside a sealed wall. She would have smelled smoke only after the fire had spread behind the boards where she could not reach it. The firebreak had not merely contained a spark, it had contained the entire future of the cabin. If you are invested in this story, subscribe and stay with us, because the person outside that door may already be too cold to save. The pounding came 20 minutes later, not Orson's pounding, lighter, frantic, irregular. Mina Noyes' 12-year-old nephew, Edwin, had been part of a wood hauling party heading for a stand of dead timber on the ridge above the Mercer claim. When the wind struck, the party scattered for shelter. Edwin lost the trail in the whiteout and stumbled downhill instead of up. He followed the faint glow of Althea's window, a yellow smear visible only when the wind shifted enough to thin the snow for a few seconds at a time. His coat was crusted white. His mittens were frozen stiff. He could not work the door latch. His hands hung at his sides like wooden blocks while he struck the door with his forearms. Althea heard him. She heard the pattern, not the rhythmic knock of an adult, but the desperate, uneven hammering of someone losing coordination. Opening the door meant losing the room's stored heat. The cabin held warm air like a jar held water. The moment the seal broke, the wind would pour in, and the warmth would pour out, and the stove would take an hour to recover what the door lost in 30 seconds. She banked the stove. She closed the blanket partition around Nell's sleeping area. She tied a rope around her own waist and looped the other end around a wall stud so the wind could not drag her through the opening. She lifted the table away from the door brace. She pulled the braces loose. She opened the door exactly wide enough for a 12-year-old's body and grabbed Edwin by the coat front and hauled him through the gap and slammed the door shut. The temperature near the door dropped instantly. Frost formed on the interior panel within seconds, a white bloom spreading across the boards like mold growing in accelerated time. The warm pine scent that had filled the cabin was cut with a sharp metallic cold that stung the inside of her nose. Edwin collapsed on the floor. Althea stripped his frozen outer coat, his stiff mittens, his ice-packed hat. His fingers were waxy and white. They did not respond when she pressed them. His lips were pale gray. He shivered, but not strongly, a sign that worried her more than violent shaking would have, because it meant his body was running out of energy to generate heat. She wrapped him in dry wool, blankets pulled from their own bed, the last dry fabric in the cabin. She heated water to warm, not hot, and fed him small amounts with a spoon because he could not grip the cup. She placed his hands against her stomach, inside her shirt, and held them there while the heat from her body seeped into his frozen fingers. Nell watched from behind the blanket partition. She did not speak. She wrote the time in the ledger. Edwin began shivering harder after 20 minutes. The deep tremors shook his entire body. This was better. This meant his core temperature was climbing, and his muscles had enough fuel to generate heat again. Althea kept him wrapped, kept feeding warm water, kept his hands against her skin. The cabin temperature recovered slowly. Near the stove, 68 Das, the lowest it had been since the wall was finished. Far wall, 58. The door rescue had cost them 7 degrees that the stove now had to earn back one piece of pine at a time. Orson reached the cabin more than an hour after Edwin. He expected silence. No smoke was visible through the whiteout. The cabin was a dark shape that he found by stumbling into the woodpile and following the wall with his hands until he reached the door. The door resisted him. Althea had replaced the table brace after pulling Edwin inside, and the diagonal boards were nailed in place. He pounded with both fists, a heavy, adult rhythm that Althea recognized immediately. She moved the table, she pulled the braces, she opened the door. What Orson encountered was not what he had crossed the mountain expecting. A wave of warm air struck his face. The scent of pine resin, concentrated, almost sweet, filled his nose. The cabin was lit by a single oil lamp and the red glow of the stove, and in that light he saw coffee simmering in a pot beside the stove. He saw Nell sitting cross-legged on the mattress with a ledger and a pencil, recording numbers. He saw Edwin breathing under a mound of blankets, his color returning, his shivering now vigorous and rhythmic. He saw Althea standing beside the stove with a bandaged hand and a rope still tied around her waist. Behind her, the board walls creaked faintly as wind pressed against the outer shell. Snow whispered behind the panels. The hiss of the storm existed inside the cabin. It lived in the space between the logs and the boards, but it could not enter the room where people lived. The near stove thermometer read 75 degrees. The far wall read 67. Orson stood in the doorway until Althea pulled him inside and closed the door behind him. His eyebrows were white with ice. His beard was frozen into a solid mass. His hands shook so badly that when Althea poured him coffee, he could not lift the cup. He had come to carry them out. He had roped himself to a horse and abandoned the horse and crawled uphill through pines in an 80-mile-an-hour wind because he believed he was recovering bodies. Instead, he sat at Asa's cramped table in a room that smelled of pine and coffee and listened to winter destroy the outer wall of a cabin whose inner wall held perfectly still. They rotated watch through the night. Althea tended Edwin and monitored the door bay. Orson secured the chimney binding and tested the door brace at half-hour intervals. Nell recorded temperatures and counted pieces of wood consumed. Every hour, Althea opened the inspection panel at the base of the fire break and checked the pipe chase. Stone, clay, air, no embers, no heat on the combustible side. Orrin's system held. The unfinished door bay developed thick frost on its inner surface, water vapor from the room condensing against the poorly insulated boards. But the frost stayed on the surface. It did not penetrate the blanket packing. The diagonal braces held the boards against the wind. The section was cold, but not open. At the storm's worst, the hours when the fort's instruments later recorded 8 degrees below zero with sustained wind at 84 miles per hour. The cabin interior held. Near the stove, 68 degrees at its lowest after both door openings. Far north wall, 60 degrees, slowly recovering. The coffee in the pot remained liquid without standing on the stove. At Mina Noyes' ranch, wind drove through 2 failed window joints that no one had repaired in the autumn. The family burned nearly their entire emergency wood reserve in a single night and retreated into the smallest room, sealing the door with blankets and sleeping in a pile with coats and quilts. Mina's husband developed frostbite on 3 toes despite never leaving the house. A line shack on exposed ground east of the fort lost part of its roof. One ranch hand was found alive the next morning, severely frostbitten, behind a haystack where he had burrowed into the straw and waited for the wind to decide whether he lived or died. Across the open range, the broader catastrophe was playing out. Cattle freezing in draws, drifting against fences, dying by the thousands in a winter that would end the open range cattle era in Montana Territory. Inside Althea's cabin, the thermometer read 71 at dawn. The wind was dropping. The hiss behind the boards was fading. Edwin opened his eyes and asked for water in a clear voice. Orson sat at the table with both hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had been warm all night. He looked at the board wall. He looked at the snow melting from his coat onto a dry floor. He had crossed the mountain to save a woman and her child from a frozen cabin. He understood now that he had walked into the safest room for miles, and that the woman who built it had pulled him through the door the same way she had pulled the boy, without hesitation, without gratitude, without asking whether he deserved the warmth. The storm died at mid-morning. The silence that followed was so complete that Nell looked up from the ledger, startled, as though silence were a new kind of noise. At daylight, Althea opened 4 inspection panels along the north wall and crouched beside each one with a lamp. She found minor settlement, 2 to 3 inches at the top of the tallest bays, where the weight of the fill had compressed the lower material overnight. She found frost on the outer log side of the cavity, thick and white and crumbling when she touched it. She found dry needles near the interior boards, resinous, intact, still carrying the small air pockets between the fibers that did the actual work. She found dampness at one point beneath the north window, where meltwater had seeped through the original log joint and traveled down the inner surface of the outer wall. One location, nowhere else. No scorch marks beyond the minerals stove bay. No evidence of smoldering. No heat damage to the board surrounding the pipe chase. The stone and clay fire break was cold on the fill side and warm on the stove side, exactly as Orrin had designed it. She marked every defect on her drawing with the carpenter's pencil. The settlement locations, the moisture point, the frost line. She measured each deficiency and wrote the number beside it. She did not present the wall as flawless. She presented it as a system that had survived its first major test and needed specific corrections, the same way a roof needed patching, and a chimney needed cleaning, and a stove needed blacking, and none of those maintenance needs meant the structure had failed. Orson watched her crawl along the base of the wall with her lamp and her feed bill drawings, cataloging problems in a system that had just saved 4 lives. He had carried a near-dead boy through wind that flattened trees. He had crossed a mountain expecting to find a frozen cabin, and now he sat at a table drinking warm coffee while the woman who had built the walls documented a 2-inch settlement gap with the focus of a surveyor filing a claim. He said nothing. He was beginning to understand that Althea did not celebrate results. She inspected them. The Fort McGinnis post-surgeon arrived 2 days later to examine Edwin. The boy's fingers had recovered feeling, though 2 remained swollen and discolored at the tips. The surgeon, Tio, a methodical army man named Chalmers who documented everything because the army required documentation and because Chalmers believed that medicine was measurement, credited warm shelter and the rapid removal of wet clothing with preventing serious tissue death. He noted in his report that the cabin interior had maintained temperatures consistent with a well-constructed frame building despite being a single-wall log structure with confirmed chinking failure. A fort clerk named Phipps accompanied Chalmers. Phipps maintained the post's weather instruments and had recorded the official storm readings. Minimum temperature 8 degrees below zero. Maximum sustained wind estimated at 84 miles per hour. Duration of extreme conditions approximately 14 hours. He asked to see Althea's temperature record. Nell brought the ledger to the table. The pages were stained with coffee from the pot that had sat beside the stove all night and marked in a child's careful handwriting. Numbers written in neat columns, 1 entry every 30 minutes. The timestamps occasionally smudged where Nell's sleeve had dragged across the wet ink. Phipps compared the figures line by line. Fort minimum, 8 below zero. Cabin near stove minimum, 68 degrees, recorded during the period immediately after both Dr. Opening's, the rescue of Edwin, and the entry of Orson. Cabin far wall minimum, 59 degrees during the emergency panel failure at the door bay, recovering into the low 60s within approximately 2 hours as the braces held and the stove recovered. Wood consumed during the 12 worst hours, roughly half of what Althea had burned during a milder night before the wall was built. Phipps wrote the comparison in his own notebook with the care of a man who understood that numbers outlasted opinions. He did not use the word insulation. He used the phrase interior lining and fill. He asked Althea how deep the cavity was. She told him 10 to 12 inches on 3 walls and 4 inches of compressed blanket beside the door. And the fill material? Phipps asked. Dry pine needles, screened, dried near the stove for several days, and kept at least 3 feet from any heat source. Phipps looked at Chalmers. Chalmers looked at the board wall. Neither man said anything that constituted an official endorsement. But Phipps asked whether he could bring the post commander's wife to see the installation, and Chalmers asked whether the method could be adapted for a hospital ward that bled heat through its north-facing windows every winter. Word traveled from the fort the way word traveled from every military post in the territory, through officers' wives who wrote letters, through sutlers who talked to freight drivers, through soldiers on leave who mentioned it to families in Maiden, through the telegraph operator who included it in a personal note to a colleague at a downstream station. Within a week, the cabin on the Mercer claim had become a piece of local information, not famous, not celebrated, just known, the way a good well or a reliable ford was known, passed from one practical person to the next. Tobias Venn came back on the 3rd day after the storm. He came alone, on foot, carrying his belt knife and a pry bar. He did not send word ahead. He did not announce himself as an inspector. He announced himself as a man who had spoken with authority about a subject and needed to determine whether he had been wrong. He removed a board himself, not one of Althea's removable panels, a nailed board on the north wall at chest height in the section that had taken the storm's worst direct pressure. He worked the nails out carefully without splitting the wood, using the pry bar with the patience of someone who intended to put the board back exactly where he found it. The cavity was exposed. He held his lantern into the gap and looked. Snow sat inside the original log shell. Frost coated the inner surfaces of the logs, a white crust that glittered in the lantern light. Wind had deposited ice crystals throughout the outer half of the cavity during the storm. The fill on that side was cold and stiff, where frozen moisture from the snow had wicked into the outermost needles. But beyond the frost line, roughly 4 inches from the log's surface, the needles were dry, and against the interior boards, the fill was warm, loose, and smelled of resin. The temperature gradient was visible in the material itself. Frozen against the logs, cold in the middle, warm against the room. The cavity contained the entire Montana winter in a 12-inch cross-section, and the room side was dry. Venn replaced the board. He drove the nails back with 3 precise strokes each, a carpenter's habit, driving a nail as if every hammer blow were being watched, and sealed the seam with a cloth strip he carried in his coat pocket for testing window gaskets. He sat at the table. He placed his hands flat on the surface. He looked at the walls he had condemned 7 weeks earlier. I said boards could only hide where winter entered, Venn said. His voice was quiet, and the quietness carried more weight than volume could have. You did hide it. You hid it from the room where people had to live. Then he asked to see everything. The inspection panels, the fire break, the pipe chase, the removable top boards, the cloth seals, the clay at the floor junctions. Althea showed him each element. He examined them with the thoroughness of a man who had spent 40 years building structures that lasted, and who understood that lasting meant inspecting, not building once and walking away. He did not declare the system flawless. He listed the conditions that made it work and the conditions under which it would kill someone. Dry fill only, never green needles, never lower layer duff, never material that had been rained on without redrying. Fire-free stove bay, stone, clay, iron, and an empty pipe chase with an inspection panel, maintained every season. Removable panels at top and bottom of every wall section, checked after every storm and every thaw. Settlement correction. Refilling compressed bays each autumn with fresh dry material. Roof and window repair completed before any wall filling. Water entering the cavity from above would saturate the fill within weeks. No installation against rotted logs, and no sealed wet organic matter under any circumstances. The method works because you followed rules, Venn said. It will kill someone who does not. He said this looking directly at Althea, and she understood that the warning was not criticism. It was prophecy. Other people would attempt this wall. Some of them would skip steps. And the consequences of skipping steps with 300 pounds of dry combustible material inside a room with an iron stove were not abstract. Mina Noyes came the same week. She did not bring sacks this time. She brought an apology. She had allowed the church sewing circle to discuss Nell's future guardianship in the weeks before the storm. 2 women had debated which family should take the child after the inevitable. Mina had not started the conversation. She had not stopped it either, and the silence of a practical woman in a sewing circle carried the same weight as agreement. I should have said she was building something, Mina told Althea. I did not say it because I did not believe it myself. She asked to examine the wall. Althea opened a panel and let Mina reach into the cavity. Mina felt the temperature gradient, cold toward the logs, warm toward the room. She pressed her open hand flat against the interior boards and held it there while wind moved behind the outer shell with the muffled sound of water running beneath ice. The boards were warm. The storm was audible, but separated, existing in a space the room did not share. Will you help me line one room before the next storm? Mina asked. On 2 conditions, Althea said. You gather only dry material, tested the way I showed you, and you install the stove exclusion zone, stone, clay, iron, and empty chase. No fill within 3 feet of any heat source. Mina agreed immediately. Then she pointed at the doorbay. That is where it will come through next time, Mina said. She was right. But she was thinking about the wall as a system with identifiable weaknesses rather than a desperate gamble. That shift, from doubt to maintenance, was the conversion that mattered more than any words. 5 households requested help within the month. Word had spread through the fort, through Maiden, and through the ranch country below the mountains. The requests came from miners' wives, from a bachelor homesteader whose cabin was worse than Althea's had been, and from the family of the ranch hand who had nearly died behind a haystack with frost-bitten hands that might never close properly again. Althea refused to sell the method. She refused to call it an invention. She held an open demonstration behind Oren's workshop on a cold Saturday, when the Maiden stores were busy and people passed within earshot. She set up the 2-box experiment with heated stones. She hung a wool thread in front of a mock wall panel and showed how sealed boards stopped air movement. She opened sacks of dry and damp litter side by side and made observers smell the difference, snap the needles, feel the temperature difference between material that would insulate and material that would rot. She built a miniature mineral fire break on the workbench and dropped a live coal against it while people watched. The coal died on the stone. Nothing burned. Then she explained what the wall could not do. It could not repair rotten logs. It could not stop a roof leak. It could not make a dangerous chimney safe. It could not survive without inspection. It was not a miracle. It was maintenance, the same ongoing, seasonal, unglamorous maintenance that every frontier structure required. 12 people stayed for the full demonstration. 8 asked questions. 3 asked for help building. Lyman Dorr was not among them, but Dorr's store clerk was, and by nightfall, Dorr knew that a woman he had tried to purchase for $30 was teaching his customers how to survive with less firewood that Dorr sold on credit at prices he set. Dorr's first response was commercial. He obtained a shipment of manufactured wool felt through his freight connections and displayed it in his store as safe interior lining material, fire-resistant, vermin-proof, professionally prepared. The felt was legitimate. It would have worked. It also cost $6 per roll, and a cabin required 8 to 12 rolls. The total exceeded what most maiden families spent on provisions in a full month. His second response was personal. He told customers that Edwin had survived because Orson brought firewood and body heat, not because of the wall. The wall was coincidental. The wall was dangerous. A widow's experiment with forest litter was not something a responsible father should replicate in a house with children. He demanded full payment of Althea's remaining balance, $30 after the cow's value had been deducted, within 60 days. The wagon would follow if the debt was not settled. The debt was real, but the timing was a weapon. Stop teaching or lose your last means of hauling material. Orrin and Althea spent the weeks after the storm building what they never named but what amounted to a teaching system. They worked side by side in his workshop, Orrin sitting because his hip no longer tolerated standing for more than an hour at a stretch, Althea standing because her wrist worked better when her arm hung at her side. He sat low. She stood close. Their working distance was less than 3 feet, and they handed tools and pages back and forth with the economy of 2 people who had learned each other's reach. They created a written installation sequence using drawings for settlers who could not read English fluently. Each page showed one step. Each step had a drawing of correct practice on the left and incorrect practice on the right. The incorrect drawings were marked with a large X and a single word, wrong. The sequence had 14 steps. Inspect the log shell for structural rot. Repair the roof against water entry. Seal the chimney passage with stone and clay. Build the mineral firebreak with empty chase. Frame the interior wall at the specified depth. Board and batten the wall surface with staggered joints. Seal all seams with cloth and paste. Gather and screen fill material. Dry the fill near but safely distant from the stove. Pack the fill loosely to preserve trapped air. Install removable top panels for refilling. Install removable inspection panels at the base. Test the stove bay with a live coal. Record the date and sign your name. The 14th step was Orrin's addition. He wanted every installation to carry a name. Someone responsible for the work. Someone who would feel accountable when the inspection panels needed opening in October. During these working weeks, Orrin's history surfaced in fragments, not through confessions or fireside stories, but through the work itself, the way knots in wood reveal themselves only when the plane strips the surface. He mentioned the shipyard in Maine, where he had learned to frame a hull, how the ribs of a ship and the studs of a wall served the same structural purpose, how both existed to hold a skin against pressure from outside. He mentioned an army hospital in Virginia where he had rebuilt a ward wall after a fire and learned that an empty airspace between 2 wall surfaces slowed flame, spread as effectively as it slowed cold. He mentioned the saw that took his fingers, a circular blade in a Helena mill, the guard removed by the foreman for speed, the decision that cost Orrin 2 fingers and cost the foreman nothing because the foreman filed the report. He never mentioned a wife. He never mentioned children. Althea did not ask. Some solitudes explain themselves through arrangement, through a workshop where everything sits within one man's reach, where the stove is positioned for 1 chair, where the single cup on the shelf has never needed company. They disagreed once, sharply, and the disagreement would return to haunt both of them. Orrin wanted the installation guide to require professional chimney inspection before any wall filling began, a signed approval from a builder or stove man. Althea argued that most cabins in the district had never seen a professional inspector, and requiring one would prevent the poorest families, the ones who needed the wall most, the ones who could not afford doors felt, from building it at all. A bad chimney next to dry fill is not insulation, Orrin said. It is a fuse. A family freezing in an uninspected cabin is not safer than a family warm in one, Althea replied. The silence between them lasted a full minute. Orrin looked at his three-fingered hand. He was thinking about the saw guard that should have been there and was not. The guide included chimney inspection as a strongly recommended step rather than an absolute requirement, accompanied by a full-page drawing showing what a dangerous chimney looked like: cracked mortar, shifted pipe joints, missing spark screens, gaps between chimney and ceiling. A homeowner who could not hire an inspector could at least see what to look for. Orrin accepted the compromise. He signed the guide's cover page. He did not say whether he believed it was enough. Orrin gave Althea his carpenter's square on a Tuesday afternoon in late March. He held it across the workbench, a steel L-shaped tool with measurements etched along both arms, the edges worn smooth from 40 years of marking cut lines on lumber that became walls. Althea refused it as a gift. She had refused every gift since the funeral. Gifts created obligation, and obligation was a currency she could not afford to carry. Orrin sold it to her for 1 cent. She placed the penny on his bench. He dropped it into his vest pocket. The transaction was witnessed by a workbench, a cold forge, and a winter window full of pale light. That square has built more walls than either of us will see, Orrin said. It does not care who holds it. His last completed project was a wooden measuring gauge, a flat piece of hardwood with notches filed at 8 inches, 10 inches, and 12 inches, the 3 cavity depths Althea used for different wall installations. He carved the notches without telling her. The numbers were burned into the wood with a heated nail, each digit precise and permanent. 3 weeks after the square changed hands, Orrin did not appear at his workshop on a Monday morning. The assay office clerk found him in his chair beside a cold stove. He was sitting upright with his 3-fingered hand resting on the chair arm. On the workbench sat an unfinished child's desk, small, carefully joined with dovetails that his damaged hand should not have been able to cut, intended for someone the clerk could not identify. Beside the desk lay his carpenter's pencil, worn flat on one side from decades of marking. Sawdust sat on his left sleeve. Althea learned of his death from Mina, who rode up the track at noon. She walked to the workshop before the clerk had disturbed anything. She looked at the desk. She looked at the pencil. She looked at the cold stove and the empty chair and the sawdust that remained because the sleeve it rested on would never be brushed. She picked up the measuring gauge from its place beside the pencil. She carried it back to the cabin and set it on the shelf beside Dora's refused envelope. Then she sat at Asa's table with her hands over her face, while Nell climbed silently into her lap and stayed. The stove needed wood. She fed it after a while. She did not know how long she had been sitting. The gauge on the shelf caught the lamplight. 8, 10, 12, carved in a dead man's hand. The secondary crisis arrived in October, and it proved Orrin right about chimneys in the worst possible way. A school trustee named Garrett Boyce had attended Althea's spring demonstration and decided to line the maiden schoolroom before winter. He bought scrap boards and sent older students to gather pine litter from the slopes above town. He built the interior wall himself over 2 weekends. The boards were reasonably straight. The battens were nailed. The fill was packed. He did not build a mineral fire break. He did not construct a pipe chase. He did not leave an exclusion zone around the stovepipe. He packed dry pine needles directly behind the sheet iron stovepipe shield, because the shield, he reasoned, already protected the wall from direct contact. He did not install inspection panels because he did not want students pulling boards loose during lessons. He did not read the installation guide beyond the first 3 pages. He did not ask Althea to inspect the work. On a Tuesday morning in late October, during a spelling lesson, the wall behind the stove began to smoke. The teacher smelled it first, a sweet, heavy scent that was not wood smoke and not coal smoke, but something between the two. She stopped the lesson. She walked to the stove and placed her hand against the board wall behind it. The boards were hot, not warm from radiant heat, which was normal, hot from behind, which was not. She evacuated 16 children through the front door in under 2 minutes. The youngest was crying. The oldest was carrying the youngest. The teacher was the last person out, and as she turned back from the doorway, she saw a brown line appear along a board seam, smoke seeping through the batten in a continuous thread that thickened as she watched. No one was hurt. No one was burned. The volunteer fire crew arrived and pulled the boards off the affected section, exposing a 4-foot area of charred, smoldering pine fill that had been heating slowly for weeks, approaching ignition through sustained radiant contact rather than open flame. Althea arrived an hour later, summoned by a boy who had run uphill to the Mercer claim. She examined the damage with the same systematic attention she brought to her own inspections. She pulled the charred fill apart with her bare hands, ignoring the heat, and found exactly what Orrin had predicted. Less than 2 inches between the stovepipe and the nearest organic material. No mineral chase, no stone, no clay, no iron shield with an air gap. Damp boards from the initial construction slowly drying against hot metal, which had accelerated the heating of the fill behind them. Needles touching the stovepipe shield. With no separation, no airspace, no inert material, nothing but combustible fiber against hot iron, and no inspection panel that would have revealed the heating before it reached the ignition point that pine needles reach when held near sustained heat. Lyman Dorr arrived within the hour. He had been in his store when the children evacuated, and he walked up the street with the measured pace of a man who has been waiting for an event and does not need to rush because the event is doing his work for him. He stood in the schoolroom doorway and surveyed the damage. Then he turned to the crowd gathered outside. "The pine needle wall is a fire trap," Dorr said. His voice carried the full width of the street. "Every cabin in this district that contains this material should be opened and emptied before someone's child burns to death." He was half right. The wall as Boyce built it was dangerous. The wall as Althea designed it, with Orrin's fire break and chase and inspection system, had survived a storm, contained a falling ember, and heated a room for months without damage. The distinction was critical, but distinctions require patience, and a crowd watching smoke pour from a schoolroom wall does not have patience. Althea stood in the charred room and faced a choice that would define whether her method survived the winter or died in the street. She could protect her reputation by blaming Boyce, his shortcuts, his ignorance, his refusal to read beyond page 3. Or she could tell the complete truth, which was harder and less flattering and more useful. She chose the truth. "The needles burned," Althea said to the crowd. "The wall was built against every rule we published. Both facts belong in the same account." She walked anyone willing to follow through the damage, step by step. She showed the insufficient clearance and compared it to the guide's diagram. She showed the absent chase and the absent stone and the absent clay. She showed where fill had been packed against hot iron and explained what happens when dry organic material sits against a sustained heat source for weeks. She placed a copy of the installation guide beside the charred section and pointed to the pages Boyce had not read. Then she acknowledged what Dorr wanted everyone to fear. The material was combustible. It would always be combustible. It was pine needles, not stone. The safety of the system depended entirely on the discipline of the builder, the same way a loaded rifle depended on the discipline of the hand that held it. If the discipline failed, the result was fire. That was not a defect in the method. It was a condition of the method. Boyce stood at the edge of the crowd with his hat in his hands and said nothing. He had built a wall without reading the rules, and the wall had done what combustible material always does near uncontrolled heat. If this story reminds you why the smallest details are never small, share it with someone who believes that preparation is just worry with a different name. Because what happened next in that schoolroom proved that the rules were never optional. Althea redesigned the school wall without Orrin. She had his gauge. She had his guide. She had his square. She had the 14-step sequence they had drawn together in his workshop. She did not have his bench demonstrations, his ability to predict where a mistake would travel before the first nail was driven, or the quiet authority of a man with 40 years of construction behind his voice. She had to find those answers in the rules he left behind, rules she had helped write, rules she had argued against in his workshop, rules whose purpose she now understood with the clarity that only absence provides. The rebuilt wall included a full stone and clay chimney bay, extending 3 feet on each side of the stove and a 4 feet above, packed with rubble and creek sand. An empty airspace surrounded every hot surface. Pipe, stove back, chimney collar, with iron spacers holding the nearest board away from the metal. A visible inspection door, framed with a wire screen behind glass, allowed the teacher to check the chase without removing any hardware. A replaceable mineral board section nearest the stove could be pulled and examined each autumn, and no organic fill of any kind existed within the stove zone. She supervised the rebuilding over 4 days, directing volunteer labor from 3 families, while Tobias Venn inspected the chimney clearances and approved each stove zone modification before any fill was installed. Boyce provided all the lumber at his own expense. He carried stone without speaking. He did not argue. He did not defend. He carried stone. When the wall was complete, Althea conducted a deliberate high-fire test. She loaded the stove to maximum capacity and maintained it for 6 hours while Venn, the schoolteacher, Mina, and the fort surgeon monitored temperatures at the fill boundary, inside the chase, and in the room. The chase remained cool. The fill boundary held stable. The room climbed to 74 degrees while October wind pushed the outdoor air down to 28. The stove consumed measurably less wood than it had the previous autumn without the lining. Venn signed the installation guide's final page, the page Orrin had created for accountability. His signature meant the method had passed the scrutiny of its most prominent critic, and that the safety system had been tested to the standard of a man who built for a living. People came to Althea now. The direction had reversed. A miner's wife walked 3 miles to ask about moisture testing. A rancher rode up from the basin to ask whether the same principle applied to cattle sheds. The fort quartermaster sent a letter with an official seal inquiring about reducing wood consumption in the enlisted barracks. She answered each inquiry the way she answered her own inspections, specifically, measurably, and honestly about limits. She told the rancher that animal breath would saturate wall fill within weeks unless ventilation was designed into the structure. She told the quartermaster that barracks framing differed from log construction and the method required adaptation, not copying. She made one farmer pull damp fill he swore would dry inside the wall. She refused to approve a wall built against a cracked chimney. She required Mina to rebuild a sloppy door seam even after Mina protested. The room was already warmer than it had ever been. She taught the way Oren had taught her, through demonstration, through testing, through the stubborn insistence that cutting corners did not save time but stored consequences. But Dor still held her debt. Dor still sold manufactured felt at prices only comfortable families could afford. And Dor still told anyone who would listen that the schoolroom fire proved the method was dangerous, that only professional materials sold through his store could be trusted with children's lives. The winter of 1888 approached. Althea had Oren's gauge, his guide, his square, and his rules. She did not have Oren, and the hardest season she would face as a teacher, the season when she had to enforce the standards alone, without the man whose authority had given the rules their weight, was weeks away. By the winter of 1888, Althea's work had stopped looking like a single woman's improvised survival method and had become something closer to a seasonal trade, though she never called it that and never charged for it in coin. She ran her operation the way Oren had taught her to run a workshop, through exchange rather than commerce. Settlers who wanted a lined wall gathered and dried their own fill under her instruction. Mine carpenters, several of whom had known Oren for decades, donated board ends they would otherwise have burned as scrap. Families fed the work crews during construction, beans, bread, whatever the season allowed. Althea inspected every stove bay personally before approving a design as complete. Tobias Venn approved chimney modifications and structural repairs, his signature now carrying the weight of 40 years of professional judgment applied in service of a method he had once publicly called a hayrick. Mina kept written records of every installation, Owan, dates, cavity depths, materials used, defects found and corrected, in a ledger she maintained with the same seriousness Nell had once brought to a storm night. Orson hauled lumber and fill between isolated claims whenever his courier routes allowed, charging nothing beyond the cost of feed for his horses. By the season's first snowfall, 23 rooms across the Maiden and Fort McGinnis district had received some version of the lined wall treatment, supervised directly by Althea. Several more households had adopted partial elements, a firebreak here, a single insulated wall there, without waiting for her full instruction, which she accepted as inevitable and tried to correct through the circulating guide rather than through confrontation, she could not sustain across an entire district. A typical day during construction season began before dawn. Althea walked from claim to claim carrying Oren's carpenter's square and the measuring gauge with its notches at 8, 10, and 12 inches. She inspected framing before boards went up. She tested fill by smell and by snap. She walked every family through the 14 steps in order, refusing to skip ahead even when a homeowner insisted they understood the principle and wanted to move faster. A rancher named Foss Redding, impatient to finish before an early cold snap, tried to pack green needles into his cavity because dry material was scarce that autumn, and his patience was scarcer still. "The wall does not care what you understand," Althea told him, pulling a handful of his green fill apart to show the moisture beading on her palm. "It cares what you do. Green needles behind a board seam will rot your studs by spring and give you nothing in return but the smell of it." She sent him back up the mountain to gather drier material before she would help him proceed, and she did not soften the refusal, even as he argued that his family would freeze while he waited on her standards. "Your family will freeze faster in a wall that rots from the inside," she said. "Go back up the mountain." He went. 3 days later, he returned with proper material, and she helped him finish his wall before the season's first hard freeze, without mentioning the argument again. She taught younger apprentices the same way, through demonstration, correction, and the refusal to let convenience override the rules Oren had died enforcing. A miner's son named Tam Iverson, perhaps 16, began following Althea on her inspection rounds that autumn, carrying tools and asking questions with the particular hunger of a boy who wanted a trade that did not require going underground. She let him carry the square. She let him test fill by feel while she watched his hands and corrected his grip. She let him make mistakes on scrap material before she let him touch a family's actual wall. "You will be tempted to skip the inspection panels," she told him, showing him how to fit one flush against a stud without nailing it permanently shut. "Every builder is tempted. The panels cost time you feel you do not have, but a wall you cannot open is a wall you cannot trust, no matter how well you built it the first time." Tam absorbed the lesson the way Althea had once absorbed Oren's, not through a single conversation, but through months of repetition, correction, and the slow accumulation of a discipline that eventually became instinct rather than instruction. By the following spring, Tam could inspect a completed cavity and identify a moisture problem before Althea pointed it out, and she began sending him to smaller jobs alone, trusting the rules he now carried as thoroughly as she did. Not every lesson landed cleanly. A widowed miner named Halvard Skye, working a claim 2 ridges over, insisted on installing his wall without the mineral fire break because he had already spent his savings on boards and could not afford the stone hauling labor. He argued that he would simply keep his fill 4 feet from the stove instead of 3, and trust distance rather than material to do the work. Althea refused to approve the installation and refused, for the first time in her teaching career, to help complete it. 4 feet of air is not the same as 3 feet of stone and clay, she told him. Distance changes with a shifted stovepipe. Stone does not move. Skay built the wall anyway, without her supervision, using only the distance he could afford. She did not report him to anyone, because there was no authority to report him to, and she did not sabotage his work out of spite. She simply refused her name and her inspection, and she made sure he understood, in plain terms, that any request for help after a fire would come too late to matter. His wall stood through 2 winters without incident, and Althea inspected it uninvited each October regardless, standing outside his door until he let her check the pipe clearance with her own hands. She never told him whether she thought he had been foolish or fortunate. Both were possible, and she had learned from Oren that certainty about outcomes not yet observed was its own kind of carelessness. Lyman Dorr's resolution did not arrive as an apology. It arrived as weather. A windstorm in late November, smaller than the February catastrophe but sharp enough to test any building in the district, tore a section of roofing from Dorr's store and the boarding rooms above it. Dorr had installed his manufactured felt in the front office, where customers and account books required a professional appearance. He had not installed it in the upper sleeping rooms, where boarders paid less, and his own calculations found the expense unjustified. The wind found the unlined rooms immediately. Boarders, miners between shifts, 2 freight drivers waiting out the season, a widowed seamstress who rented the smallest room at the cheapest rate. Spent a night huddled in blankets while wind drove through gaps Dorr had never bothered to seal in a building he owned outright and had never once inspected the way he had inspected other men's cabins for reasons to doubt them. By morning, several of the boarders had walked the half-mile to the community workshop that Althea, Mina, and a rotating group of volunteers had built earlier that autumn behind Oren's old shop, a shared warming room with a proper stone stove bay and pine-filled walls, built originally as a demonstration space and increasingly as a genuine shelter for anyone caught without adequate heat. Dorr arrived last, after his own boarders, with frost whitening his cheeks and his breath coming in short, controlled bursts that suggested he had walked faster than his dignity preferred. Inside, he found poor miners sharing a bench with ranch families. He found his own store clerk drinking coffee beside a rancher he had once denied credit. He found the stove burning steadily, without roaring, in a room that held its heat the way his own building had failed to. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before anyone noticed him. Mina saw him first. She did not offer him coffee. She watched him take in the room, the warmth, the mixed company, the absence of anything he could sell them that they now needed less of. Dor crossed to where Althea sat with the installation ledger open on her knees. He did not deliver a sentimental apology. He was not a sentimental man, and Althea had never asked him to become one. He reached into his coat and produced her account ledger page, the one marked Mercer, the $42 now reduced through partial payments, and the deducted value of the cow to $12 remaining. He tore the page free and set it on the table in front of her. "I priced the claim," Dor said. "I never priced what you would make of it." Althea did not accept the gesture as a debt forgiven because she had never asked for forgiveness of a debt she owed. "The account was already settled through labor and materials," she said. "I do not need a torn page to know what I built." Dor did not argue the point. He looked around the room once more. At the mineral stove bay he recognized now from a dozen conversations he had dismissed. At the fill he had once called forest rubbish. At the community that had built something he could not undercut with pricing alone. His final acknowledgement came not in words but in action, delivered over the following weeks rather than in a single dramatic gesture. He donated his store's remaining scrapboards to the community supply. He offered warehouse space for drying fill through the winter months, at no charge, to anyone who asked. He stopped advertising the felt as a replacement for Althea's method and began selling it instead as a supplementary material for families who could afford both approaches. He did not become an ally. He remained a merchant who understood now that some products could not be undercut by pricing alone, only by better weather than the winter had any intention of providing. Community transformation showed itself in details rather than declarations. Before the winter of '88, roof and chimney inspections had been optional, performed by whoever remembered and however thoroughly their patience allowed. By the following autumn, inspections preceded insulation as a matter of course, not because a law required it, but because everyone in the district had heard about the schoolroom fire and understood exactly why the sequence mattered. Drying racks appeared under sheds across the basin, wooden frames holding pine litter in thin layers where autumn sun and rising stove heat could reach it. Families began measuring fuel consumption the way Nell had once measured cabin temperature, recording pieces burned per night, comparing one winter to the next, treating firewood as a resource to be tracked rather than simply depleted until it ran out. Settlers began reserving one genuinely warm room rather than attempting to heat every space in an unfinished structure. This was, in its way, the most significant shift, not the technical method itself, but the underlying principle Althea had spent a winter proving, that concentrating limited resources into a defensible space succeeded where spreading them thin across an entire building failed. Mineral stove bays, stone, clay, iron, empty chase, bois became a recognizable construction feature across the district, taught by word of mouth from one builder to the next, modified for different stove designs and cabin layouts, but consistent in their core principle. Even families who never lined a full wall began building proper fire breaks around their stoves, because the schoolroom fire had taught that lesson independent of everything else. Althea's diagrams circulated without charge, copied by hand, passed between families, occasionally amended by builders who discovered a local variation that worked better for their particular cabin. She did not object to the amendments. She had learned from Orrin that a rule which could not survive adaptation to local conditions was not a rule worth enforcing rigidly. She objected only when an amendment removed a safety element rather than adjusting a construction detail, and she objected loudly in person every time she encountered it, walking 3 miles if necessary to correct a builder who had cut a corner she recognized from Boyce's schoolroom. Orson Vale's courtship of Althea Mercer occurred almost entirely through shared work, which suited them both. He never proposed in the weeks immediately following the storm. He understood without being told that a woman who had just buried a husband and nearly lost a child to cold had no room in her calculations for romance, and that offering it too soon would read as another man assuming he understood her needs better than she did. Instead, they hauled boards together in silence on cold mornings. They argued about whether a mountain trail was safe to cross an early spring melt, Orson insisting on caution born from years of reading weather that had nearly killed him more than once, Althea insisting on practicality born from a winter that had taught her exactly how much delay cost. They repaired Mina's roof together before lining her walls, because Orson had learned enough from watching Oren's methods that he could frame a roof section competently, and because working beside Althea had become, without either of them naming it, the part of his week he looked forward to most. They drank coffee after every completed inspection, a habit that started during the storm and continued because neither of them found a reason to stop it. Orson learned slowly and through several corrections to ask whether Althea wanted help before offering it, rather than assuming a woman working alone required rescue. The first time he tried to lift a board out of her hands without asking, she set it back down herself and told him plainly that she would ask when she needed a second pair of hands. He did not make the mistake again. Althea, in turn, learned more slowly that accepting skilled partnership from a man who respected her judgment was not the same as surrendering the independence she had fought a winter to preserve. Their conversations rarely touched on feelings directly. They discussed cavity depths, moisture readings, the comparative merits of different mountain trails, the quality of a particular rancher's wood supply. But Nell noticed, watching from the edge of these exchanges, that her mother laughed more often when Orson was present, and that the laughter came easier and lasted longer than it had in the 2 years since Asa's death. They had one significant disagreement before the proposal, and it mattered more than either of them expected. Orson wanted her to reduce her teaching schedule after they married, arguing that a wife with 2 households to manage, the homestead, and the growing demand for her instruction was asking too much of one pair of hands, especially hands that still ached in cold weather from an old wagon injury. Althea did not raise her voice. She simply asked him whether he intended to stop hauling freight through winter storms once they married, since that work carried its own risks and its own toll on his body. "That is different," Orson said. "That work feeds us." "So does mine," Althea said. "It feeds families who would otherwise burn through their wood by January and freeze by March. I did not build this to abandon it because a ring changed my name." Orson considered this for several days before raising the subject again. When he did not ask her to reduce her work. He asked instead how he could arrange his courier routes to give her more uninterrupted time for it. A different question entirely, and one that told her he had actually listened rather than simply retreated. He proposed in October of the following year, while helping her install Oren's measuring gauge into a tool chest she had built for the district's shared equipment. The gauge that would outlive both of them if the chest survived, marked at 8, 10, and 12 inches in a dead carpenter's hand. Orson did not kneel. He did not make a speech. He simply asked, while fitting the last screw into the chest's hinge, whether she would consider marrying him, and he asked it the way he asked most things, directly, without decoration, prepared to accept either answer. Althea said yes only after they had agreed, explicitly and in terms she made him repeat back to her, that the homestead would remain in her name until she completed proof of the claim under the Homestead Act's residency and improvement requirements. Orson agreed without hesitation. He had watched her defend that claim against a man with far more money and far less right to it, and he understood that the land was not merely property. It was the proof that she had refused to be removed. They married in the spring of 1889, shortly after Montana entered statehood, in a ceremony that occupied a single afternoon and was not, in the larger scope of Althea's life, the most significant event of that year. So, Althea completed her homestead proof that same year and received clear title to the claim Asa had begun, and she had defended alone through the worst winter the district had recorded in a generation. She and Orson added a framed workshop to the original structure, built with proper milled lumber that Orson's savings from years of courier work could finally afford. But they retained the original 10 by 14 foot interior room, the lined room, the warm room, the room where Nell had recorded temperatures on the worst night of their lives, inside the log shell where it had always stood. Every October before the first hard freeze, Althea opened the top panels and checked the fill for settling. She added dry material where compression had left gaps. She inspected the mineral fire break, replaced any cracked clay, and tested the pipe chase for clearance. She performed this maintenance every year for the rest of her working life, and she taught Nell to perform it alongside her, the way Orrin had once taught Althea, standing close, correcting by demonstration rather than lecture. Their children, 2 sons born in the years following the marriage, grew up understanding the inspection ritual as ordinary as harvest or branding, a task that simply happened each autumn without needing explanation. Neither boy remembered a winter when the wall was new. To them, the still air behind the boards and the warm stove bay were simply how a house worked, the way a well simply produced water and a chimney simply carried smoke away. They did not know to be amazed by something that had cost their mother a husband's death, a mentor's life, and a season of near starvation to develop. Nell grew into a school teacher, not at the rebuilt maiden schoolhouse where the fire had occurred, but at a new school built a decade later in a growing settlement further down the valley, where the population had expanded enough to require a second building. She kept Orrin's measuring gauge on her own desk for the rest of her career, and she used the original 2-box heat experiment. Oh, the heated stone, the butter on the lid, the comparison between insulated and uninsulated containers. To teach her own students the principle her mother had learned from a grandfather packing ice in an Ohio hillside. She also kept the storm ledger. The pages remained coffee-stained, the numbers still recorded in a child's careful hand, the timestamps still occasionally smudged where a sleeve had dragged across wet ink during the worst hours of a February night nobody in that district would forget. Althea continued her winter inspections into her 60s, walking from claim to claim with a cane in one hand and a modified version of Orrin's Carpenter's square in the other, the original having been passed to Nell, who had asked for it the same way Orrin had once asked Althea to name the price of a tool that mattered. She trained 3 successors over the following decades, younger settlers who had grown up watching her inspect walls and who absorbed her methods the way she had once absorbed Orrin's through demonstration and correction rather than formal instruction. Each successor added refinements suited to newer building materials as the district modernized, manufactured felt where families could afford it, improved sheet metal fire breaks as blacksmithing supplies became more available, but each retained the core principle unchanged. Stop the moving air first, then slow the remaining heat, and never stop checking your own work. Tam Iverson, the miner's son who had once carried her square as an apprentice, eventually took over the majority of construction supervision in the district, freeing Althea's later years for the inspection work she preferred. Walking from cabin to cabin each autumn, opening panels, testing fill, correcting the small failures that accumulated whether or not anyone was watching. She died in the early years of the 20th century on the same claim she had refused to relinquish for $30 during the worst month of her life, in the same lined room where Nell had once measured the temperature every 30 minutes through a storm that killed cattle by the thousands across the open range. The exact circumstances of her final days belong to the private record of a family rather than to this account, which has followed her only through the parts of her life that intersected with the wall, the winter, and the people who doubted her. What can be said clearly is this: she never stopped opening the inspection panels. She never stopped checking for settlement, for moisture, for the small failures that accumulate in any system left unattended. The maintenance never became automatic enough to skip, and she never treated the method's success as evidence that vigilance could relax. Closing. 23 rooms were lined under Althea Mercer's direct supervision in the 2 years following the storm, with several more households adopting portions of the system on their own initiative. She never claimed to have invented natural insulation. Her contribution was narrower and more durable than invention, a disciplined local combination of interior air sealing, deep dry fibrous fill, accessible inspection, settlement correction, mineral fire isolation, and open teaching. The detail that outlasted every wall she built was smaller than any of these. Before each winter, families across the Judith Mountains began checking how air moved through their cabins, rather than simply counting the cords of wood stacked against the outside wall. Althea remained on the homestead she had refused to relinquish. She and Orson raised their family in the enlarged house, but the original interior wall was never torn out. Every autumn, for the rest of her life, she opened the top panels, checked for dampness, and packed in a small amount of fresh material where the old fill had settled. Nell kept Orrin's wooden gauge and her mother's storm ledger, the coffee-stained pages still marked in a child's handwriting, the temperatures still legible after decades in a cedar box. Returned to Tobias Venn's dismissal, spoken in a cabin with 40 broken joints and less than 2 cords of wood. Boards cannot make a broken wall whole. They can only hide where the winter enters. The exterior logs still took the storm, every storm, for as long as the cabin stood. Wind still moved through some of the old joints behind the boards. Snow still gathered inside the outer shell during every hard winter that followed, but it stopped there. Behind the planks, dry needles held countless small pockets of quiet air. Around the stove, stone and clay remained bare and cold on the fill side, warm on the iron side, exactly as a dead carpenter had designed them. In the occupied room, coffee steamed on a shelf beside a measuring gauge notched at 8, 10, and 12 inches. End on Orson's first arrival, not as the moment he saved her, but as the reversal that defined everything that followed. He had crossed a mountain in an 84-mile-an-hour wind expecting to carry a widow and her child out of a frozen cabin. Instead, he sat at her table, wrapped both frozen hands around a cup he could not yet lift, and listened to winter claw at the far side of a wall it could no longer cross.